As we begin this class, I'm going to ask you to please think about the present social, political, cultural conditions in many countries around the world and how all of these things put together affect the quality of life, and how in many places in the world there is extreme discontent with the status quo. The so-called Gilded Age in the United States back in the 1877 to 1900, according to your text, but I think it goes on even a little bit further, was characterized by greed, special interest groups, particularly people who had money, have money and want more money, and more money is not enough, so they want more money at the expense of anybody and everyone. An obsession with riches, an obsession with consumer material things, people using their material possessions as their identity rather than their character or their sense of morals or ethics. It's all about what I have, who I am, what kind of car. And you can carry that on into present day. Everybody's got to have a new iPhone 5, and you got to have this kind of car, and you got to live in this particular area. It's universal. Look for the causes of the rise of populism, progressivism, which we'll deal with in the next lecture. But populism, as you watch, and identify and learn to identify very quickly what is populism. And democracy substitutes elections. I put this in here. Substitutes elections by the incompetent many for the appointment of the corrupt few. And then I put all these little sayings in here by one of my favorite politicians, historians, world leaders, Winston Churchill. Not particularly happy with the outcomes of democracy sometimes. It has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except all the others that have been tried. Democracy is not perfect. It's run by human beings. But anything else other than democracy is worse. And all you have to do is look around the world and know a little bit of history, and you'll see the point. A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people take away the rights of the other 49%. Thomas Jefferson, who had his doubts about democracy too. Waving the bloody shirt, politics. United States politics in the 1870s, the 80s, the 90s. Waving the bloody shirt simply means the Southerners extremely discontent with losing the war. The bloody shirt is our young Southern men sacrificed their lives and lost their lives for a cause. They call it the cause of Southern states' rights and are defending our way of life. And then other politics were exclusionist. No blacks, political parties, no blacks, no Polacks, Irish, Asians, Hispanics, Catholics, Jews, or Mormons. I put reverse there because the Mormons say they don't want any of those other people either. And then bosses controlling politics, particularly municipal politics. We'll get into bosses. Politics was corrupt, outrageously corrupt. And I look around where I live here, and you might look around and you look in other countries, and you can see that corrupt politics is the norm. It's not the exception. Corruption at every level of politics, every level of society, it destroys society. It prevents any way that a culture can progress. The people in the United States, from the results of things like the gross monopolistic industrial maneuvers of the Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and other companies, how they gobble up what's called horizontal and vertical accumulation, how you grab everything in every direction. Then there was the increase in the government itself, and I put this little note: from the end of the Civil War until 1899, the federal jobs federal being the United States federal government, the national government, triples, more than triples. 55,000 to 166,000 people working for the government. Everyone wants to get a government job. Government jobs are guaranteed. Government jobs, when a politician is elected, he or she, well, no she's in those days, but he has the right to throw out people from the other previous administrations and then put his own people in. And they did it all the time. And I look around here, and it's most common. People want to be in favor of the winning political party, mostly not to support the political party's the platform, what does the political party stand for, but for the guarantee of a job. So you can go work for the government. Yes, in Ecuador, we have some very negative expressions of people, about people who work for the government. Appointments and promotions, the people were saying the appointments and promotions must be based on merit and examinations, not on political favoritism. Government corruption needs to be controlled. And then there was the corruption in the railroads. The government gave the railroads land to build on, to expand the transportation system. Railroads are very competitive and very unscrupulous, monopolizing as much as they could to gain profits, showing preferential treatment to certain companies that were bigger companies, and based on the larger amounts of whatever it was they transported on the railroads, undercutting the prices that they were giving to other people. Railroads, of course, fought against all government intervention to guarantee free and fair competition. They said fair competition. So how do you do that? You bribe the people in the Congress, you bribe the presidential, you bribe everybody to get what you want. And there's a word there, it says lobbyist. And I'm not sure if we explained this before. A lobbyist in the English language means someone. Well, originally refers to people who hung around the lobbies of big hotels in Washington, D.C., the lobby being the place where you enter the hotel, where the front desk is, and trying to catch a congressman or a senator by the arm and slip them a little bit of money or a lot of money and try to get them to vote whatever new laws were coming up, to vote in favor of whatever your particular cause was. If you were a lobbyist for the dairy workers of America, any laws that might have any effect on people who raised cows to produce milk, then you want to make sure that the Congress does not vote in any new laws that would be detrimental to your business. And of course, the idea was, by the business people, was keep government out of business and out of setting prices. I don't know if they have price controls in Peru, but they do here in Ecuador. The government sets the price, and for, let's say, a loaf of bread, there's something they call a canasta familiar, where the price of rice and cooking oil and, I don't know, other things are set by the government. Gasoline is government controlled. Gas, bottled gas that people use for cooking, is the price of the tank is government controlled. In a free economy, laissez-faire capitalist country, people are against this kind of thing. And then there's the question of tariffs. Tariffs, in my reading of history, governments trying to protect local industry by setting tariffs, being, I think you call in Spanish, aranceles, has always turned out in causing the reverse of what the intention was. It doesn't protect local businesses. It causes a rise in the prices of anything to the consumers. Tariffs were populist propaganda, so somebody's running for president and he says or she says, I will protect your businesses and we'll try to block the import of Chinese products or American products or our neighbors' products, so therefore what we produce will have a more competitive price. It never works. Republicans wanted higher tariffs, Democrats want lower tariffs, because Republicans have always been conservative in the United States, and the Democrats have been more liberal. And then there's monetary policy. This is kind of important because it refers to the amount of money that people have and the availability of money depends on how much money the government has in circulation. And in those days, you'll always have to remember this, the government only printed as much money as they had an equivalent of gold, how much they owned in gold. There's a place in western Kentucky called Fort Knox where the U.S. government keeps all of their gold and silver that backs up, supposedly, not anymore, it's changed over the last 100 years. We're not tied to the gold standard. But the farmers, it's again the argument of the have-nots fighting the haves. The farmers and small businesses, they needed more credit, easier credit, which means more money in circulation. The haves, those who have a lot of money, large merchants, manufacturers, and bankers, wanted a limited amount of money because they were making more money. Simple. A bank makes money on the money they loan to you to buy a car or a house or anything. If there's a lot of money in circulation, you can go to a lot of different banks. There's a lot more money available. And that competition forces any particular bank to lower its interest rates. They don't want to lower the interest rates. They want to get as much out of you as they possibly can on the shortest loan terms. In theory, and I was trying to find it. I have a $2 bill somewhere. It says on the $2 bill, and I can go to the bank and I can get $2 worth of gold. Probably be dust these days. So if you had $500 in paper money, paper dollars, you would be able to go to the bank and you can get $500 of an equivalent in gold. The issue comes out in how much silver is being made. The U.S. government did not base their let's say their metallic holdings as the basis of how much money they had. By the late 1880s and so on, silver was discovered. I believe it was in Nevada. So the people were saying much more silver is being produced. That should also be available at a ratio of, for every ounce of gold, which is $1, would take 16 ounces of silver would equal to 1 ounce of gold. And it was a big fight in the late 1880s and the 1890s. I've mentioned this quickly. After the Civil War, Andrew Johnson becomes president. Very unspectacular president. Almost was impeached for fighting with the Congress. Then Ulysses S. Grant, who was the commanding general of the Union armies in the Civil War, becomes president. His term in office was a disaster of corruption. No one ever said that Grant was corrupt, but everybody around him was corrupt. And of course, in those days, what did the president know? No one knows what the president knew or didn't know. What it was called is crony capitalism. The cronies being those people, in English I would use the word sycophant, the people who are nearest power, only telling the person in power, in Ecuador they call it chupa media, only telling that person in power what that person wants to hear and sucking up in every possible way. The American people were fed up with that, so they did elect between 1877 and 1900 a series of presidents, mostly Republicans, a couple of Democrats, that were there. And the feeling being that the president and the White House and the government in particular should not interfere with laissez-faire capitalism. But all of the presidents faced the ongoing corruption at all levels of government, all the currency problems. They all faced the same thing, and no one ever really resolved anything. And then this one mentions something else, discrimination and disenfranchisement. What it meant was simply this. No one was ever able to control racism. We won't get that in any way until the late 1950s and then through the 1960s. So by 2000, how many years ago? 7? We have a black president. It took that long. You should remember this also. Social change and cultural change and economic changes don't happen overnight. So all the things the politicians promise that they're going to do right away is not going to happen. maybe in your lifetime, if you're lucky. Violence against African Americans, not just the Ku Klux Klan, but other people too. Disenfranchisement. How do you keep African Americans from voting? Jim Crow was not a person. Jim Crow simply refers to the common laws that white people, particularly in the South, passed to keep black people from having any kind of power. And then I mentioned here, Plessy versus Ferguson, was the Supreme Court passed a law that black people could be separated as long as their separation was equal, the circumstances of their separation was equal to those of white people, meaning, for example, by the 1950s, they talk about bus stations, public institutions, universities, public schools. You could keep black people in another place as long as that place, the bus station or whatever, was the conditions, the physical conditions, was as good as it was for white people. And you must know by now that that just never going to happen. It never did happen. I remember as a child in Georgia that black people had to sit in the back of the bus. There was a yellow line across the middle of the bus, and any black people got on could not sit in front of that line. African American native activism begins to challenge, but without much power. And then I mentioned women's suffrage, women beginning to look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments and saying, why not us? Why can't we be equal also? And then I mentioned here Aguarian Unrest, the farmers. The farmers are tied to the land, the people who own the land. It's slavery. There's no other way to put it. My mother would tell me at times, she was raised in the coal mining country of eastern Kentucky, that everyone had credit with the companies. The company that owned the coal mines also owned their houses, owned the schools, owned the stores that sold them their food and stuff. So you had credit at the store, and you had to, on Friday you get paid, or once a month or once every other week, but you had to pay off your credit, so you really were working. You owed your soul to the company store was the name of a song I remember. And I'm sure that if there's a book here in Ecuador, it's called Huasipungo. Huasipungo is a story about the conditions of the huge haciendas that were owned by very rich families, mostly up in the Sierra, Quito, Ambato, Riobamba, and south, and the condition of the indigenous people there that were effectively slaves. In the same manner that my mother's family was a slave to the company store and the company owning everything. The farmers started getting together. The idea being there is some political power in numbers. And I remember as a child when my father retired from the Army, he bought a farm after he went to Cornell University and became a veterinarian. He bought a farm in the mountains of New York, way up in the mountains, and we all went, particularly on Saturdays, to the Grange meetings. A big hall was full of, everyone would bring what the Americans call potluck dinner, so everybody would bring something and they put it on a big table, and we, the kids, were always out playing softball in the field behind the Grange hall, and the parents would discuss whatever, just the news of who's got new cows and whose chicken died or whatever, but also about the legislation that affected the farmers. And they did find banking legislation, supply legislation, companies that own the big International Harvester, Massey Ferguson. Those people own the companies that make the big tractors and farm equipment. But the problem is that the people out in the country, they live far apart from each other, and it's very difficult to sustain any kind of cooperation. Populism. There's a couple things I want to explain. I've got a couple more here. Populism is the protest, the injustice of the American people, and they begin to protest in numbers. Populism says that the rights and powers of the common people in their struggle against the privileged elite. So what happens is a populist politician, and there are many. One of my favorite biographies is about Huey Long, the governor of the state of Louisiana in the 1930s. I promise every person in the state of Louisiana a chicken in every pot every week. And my mother told me that that was quite a promise in the 1930s, because if they got a chicken in their pot once a month, they felt very privileged to have something like that. The regional organizations where again, alliances and the farmers got together. The platform of populism is this. The United States, America, the American dream, whatever you want to call it, why they went to the United States from other countries, or what they expected from the United States. They expected a moral regeneration. The corruption is out of control. No one does anything about corruption. Everyone is corruptible. From every institution within society is corrupt. Political democracy means that everybody gets to vote and everyone has a right to vote, and it's protected by the government. And the people said that corruption dominates the ballot box. Your votes are corrupt. The legislatures, the Congress, and even the courts. We have a very corrupt court system here. Wealth belongs to him that creates it, and that argument is simply that we, the workers, we produce, but you, the owners of our labor, you're making all the money, and we're being paid absolutely minimum. And it's the beginning of the progressive era in American politics, which, like I said, I will explain in detail in the next class. In the 1890s, there's something happens that even more brings all of these defects in American society and culture to the head, and it was a Great Depression. And again, when we get to the 1929 Depression, the collapse of the stock market, it's a lot of the same reasons. People are beginning to work more. People have more money to spend. When they have more money to spend, they have more money to buy things that they want, consumer goods. When there's a demand for consumer goods, somebody's going to make the consumer goods, and by creating industry, you give people jobs, and those people with jobs make more money, and they spend more money, and eventually, what happened in 1929 also, they overproduced. And people bought something like a car, or like an apartment, or not apartment, a car or a house, or what's called durable goods. Well, I don't need to buy that every year. That's going to last me a long time, but the industry keeps producing and producing and producing, because if you stop producing, then you have to lay people off, and the people don't have money to buy, and it's a vicious cycle that goes on and on and on. More unemployment and decrease in purchasing power leads to more bankruptcies. The banks don't close. The people don't have access to credit. There's more unemployment, less buying, and so on. It just goes around and around and around. And then there's the currency problem, which I mentioned a little bit earlier, even to the point where the U.S. government had to buy gold from J.P. Morgan just to keep up their reserve, and that's explained in great detail. You should pay attention to that particular couple of pages. The consequences of all of this, the other thing is the world is now a globalized market. And in some countries, even today, in 2013, some countries want to set up tariffs to block the imports from other places, but they want to sell their products in the other places. So you've got this constant conflict. Back then, in the 1880s and 1890s, was the first real industrialized globalization of markets. And the Americans had to deal not just with the local American market, but had to realize that you're going to start selling your stuff worldwide and buying stuff worldwide. So the competition is different. Then comes this, what I call the socialists. In 1848, Karl Marx wrote a book called The Communist Manifesto. And in that book, my argument was, in a paper I wrote a little while ago, that was really the beginning of the Cold War. Not the Cold War, the 1940s and to 1990, between the Soviet Union and the United States, or let's say communist countries and non-communist countries, but a Cold War between the producers and the workers. Farmers, factory workers, anarchists, socialists were all ready to fight based on Marxism. And Marxism says it is naturally the rich upper class owners of capital accused all protesters of being socialists and communists, and that industrial capitalism generates profits by paying the workers less than the value of their labor, and that mechanization and mass production alienate workers from their labor. Well, there's a big argument about this. Industrial capitalism is what generates anything because they have the money, the finance. They finance building factories, building machines, buying machines, setting up the whole infrastructure. They hire the labor. The laborer comes in and sells his or her labor. But the capitalist has to pay less than the value of that labor, this is Marx talking, in order to make a profit, because all business is based on making a profit. When they do that, Marx argues, they are paying the laborer less than the value of his or her labor, which is true. Because if there's no incentive to build the factory and build the machines and buy the machines and set up the infrastructure, the laborer himself or herself wouldn't even have a job to sell their labor to. So, of course, that's my American capitalist argument. The financiers and the laborers, the producers, in an inescapable conflict, both financing and producing, it's all needed together. And I put in here, there's a couple of things. One of them is the YouTube from Khan Academy. Some of you may have heard of Khan Academy, explaining socialism, communism, and socialism. I would suggest, just no matter what you're going to major in college, to watch it. It's 15 minutes long, but it explains the economic dynamic of socialism and communism and the consequence on society and the conflict on society. Marx prophesized, and this is probably what capitalists find most scary, that the workers would revolt and seize the factories and farms and banks and transportation at what is called the commanding heights of the economy. And these are also on YouTube, and I have the books, and I've read the book and watched these videos. There are it's a series of 3 videos. It's called The Commanding Heights. And it's a story, some of you might even enjoy this, the story of the battle of ideas between socialism and capitalism in the 20th century, beginning before World War II, but throughout the 20th century, this conflict of how much government is correct to help the people, how much government is too much government, what should government be involved in? Should the government take over industries? And I mean, I don't mean just factories. I'm talking about all the mining, oil production, all the utilities, oil, water, gas. Should that be government owned or privately owned? And when it's privately owned, it's more efficient. And when it's government owned, it's much less efficient, even destroyed. And you can only look at the condition of the country of Venezuela right now, or if anybody's ever been to Cuba, it becomes very obvious. The people, the argument is, will establish a socialist order of justice. The people will set up a system of justice and equality that will end class conflict and crass materialism. Crass means vulgar. Materialism is a vulgar thing. Eventually, this socialist system of ending classless conflict will become pure communism, which no one will own no more private property. The government owns everything, and the government will distribute on a fair and equal basis to everyone.